Welcome to the Amplify podcast, presented by the Rise Collective, an organisation dedicated to empowering marginalised young creatives and building communities at the forefront of social change. Welcome to our 5th series, Inherited Worlds.
Hi, this is Val Maya with the Rise Collective, and in this episode I'm joined with the lovely Geneva, where we discuss the ongoing conflict over the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands. We talk about the history of the dispute, spanning back to the days of its colonisation, and why it's important for us in the West to pay attention to global politics and reflect on how we continue to have a large effect over former colonies. Hello.
Hi.
We are joined by the lovely Geneva Virasamy. You are a scholar of politics, history, and international relations, and I'm so excited to have you today.
So excited to be here. Thank you. Lovely introduction.
You're the author of Geneva's Convention, which great name.
It's like, I feel really bad that I've not really updated it in a while. But I suppose I am not. It feels very like...
lovely scroll on it the other day.
Do you like
cool,
it?
yeah.
I've redone it lately.
Yeah.
Does the graphic at the top work? Does it move?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's so cute.
I'm like, is it professional? But does it look like what I want it to?
I love the name. It's
Thank you.
so smart. But you discuss current affairs, share important history, and also you have some banging looking dishes on there.
Thank you.
So to start off with, I just kind of wanted to ask to like talk a bit about yourself and how you grew your passion for your subjects, and yeah.
Okay, well, passion for the subjects is like a weird one, because I feel like by virtue of being as we were saying before, a global majority background person in Britain, you are unwittingly inducted into a club where you're like, oh, I know, like I was born here and I was raised here, but I have a heritage that's, obviously different. So to be realistic, that's probably one of the main reasons why I was interested in these kind of things growing up. I think also I was lucky to have really engaged, switched on family members. So
That always helps.
yeah. Just kind of introducing these ideas from early. So in terms of politics in general, I would say that's probably like one of the biggest reasons.
Real.
Yeah.
Amazing. And like history, how did you get into history?
For my current masters.
Yeah.
That's a story.
Okay.
So it's a public history masters, which is relatively new in the UK.
Okay.
It's also it goes by different guises. So whenever people talk about history from the ground up, or like people's history, that's kind of what public history often refers to. Especially big in the States, because I think they were just kind of catching on to those ideas like a bit earlier, maybe from the 70s.
Yeah.
And some overlap here as well. In terms of how I came across it, so as you said, I did my undergraduate in international relations and politics, which, to be honest, like in the academy and at large, politics, it's undergirded by history. So a lot of what I did from undergraduate was kind of historical, just like similar to what we were talking about before, but with theory kind of peppered in. So as much as I enjoyed my undergraduate, it was fantastic. And even now, as a history student, I do sometimes think, well, I'm just like, well, we need to just get political. That's the only way we're going to get I do have that inclination, I think, but it's nice to have put on a different hat for a couple of years and look at things from what I've understood to be a temporal dimension, which just means, okay, over time, actually, how have things gone, like even further back. So I've never been in spaces where we look at pre-modern and even questioning what that means, or like ancient societies. So that's not, to be fair, the majority of what I do, but it's nice to have been in a space where I can do that. So history, I chose this module, or this master's rather, because I wanted to be able to combine my interest in politics and I suppose like historical narratives in a way that's relevant and applicable for the public. So that's for me what public history means. It means different things to different people. We have a joke in the cohort that's like, you choose your preposition and then that's what that is. So it's public, it's history for, by, or with certain groups. So that's why I chose public history. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So, getting on to the topic that we're doing today, which is partly the Chagos archipelago.
Yes.
You've done extensive research into it for the past 5 years. Could you explain a little bit about Chagos and its history for those that are unaware of its history and the island, and also why it's such an interesting and important
hot
subject for you?
topic.
Yeah, and a hot topic.
It's a hot topic right now, and
Yes.
that's why I
yeah.
wanted to kind of have this conversation, I
Yeah.
guess. So I am British Mauritian. So as I said, I was born and raised here in London, and both of my parents are from Mauritius. So there's like a significant connection because the last colonial power in Mauritius was Britain. We were independent in 1968. So Chagos is the name, as you said, for the archipelago. So it's a group of islands, not very far from Mauritius, but hopefully you can like put up an image here. So like, because it's better to actually like see it on a map.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting with the archipelago, so the main island that's spoken about is called Diego Garcia, and that's where there is a military base for the States. So the States kind of mostly populate that military base. That's why it's kind of in the news at the moment, because as much as there are discussions about who should kind of own the islands, it's always superseded by the fact that most nations don't really want that base to go.
Yeah.
Because it's like an extremely strategic location in the Indian Ocean. Diego Garcia itself is actually really interesting in terms of like how it's physically exists.
Yeah.
It looks, so it's called sometimes the footprint of freedom.
Wow.
And that's because it looks a bit like a footprint, but why it in itself is so not just its location in the ocean, but it's like it's a strip that goes like this.
Okay.
So like you can basically see anything that might be coming at you from all angles. Does that make sense?
I see.
So there's like the water in the middle.
Yeah.
But there's other islands that also make up the archipelago. So Peros Baños, and what's the other one called? I can't remember off the top of my head. I do know it. I was just thinking about it earlier. But they're like a lot. They had smaller populations. So most of the people who lived in the archipelago were on Diego Garcia.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting space in that it started to be populated from roughly like the 19th century, so the 1800s, similar to Mauritius, with people being brought over as labourers, so slave labour.
Yeah.
What that means is that since it was a few centuries ago, there were generations of people who kind of laid their roots there. So the argument which has been put forward by the International Court of Justice and by the Chagossians themselves is that they are indigenous to the land, which is why they want the kind of the right to self-determination to either go back. I mean, resettlement is like a big question right now, because obviously the people aren't a monolith. Yeah. Some of the younger ones probably want different things. Mauritians who have Chagossian heritage perhaps aren't interested in resettling it. There aren't like, you know, on the other islands that aren't Diego Garcia, there aren't like, it's not built up. Do you know what I mean? Like there aren't amenities, there aren't people there.
Yeah.
So we can understand why some people are like, well, what do you want to go back to?
Yeah.
But if you are Chagossian, obviously you're like, well, that's where like my family's graves are.
You have that connection, of course, yeah.
And it was settled previously. It's overgrown now, but it's weird if you go back. There's some really interesting footage online, which hopefully maybe we can look at as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of why it's in the news at the moment. The Chagossians want to be part of the conversation, and that's like the main issue, that they're not even really being included in the talks. So not only were they kind of erased from the history of the islands since, you know, for decades and decades, but even now, in fact, if I'll just look, so I was looking at a Telegraph article. The telly like love it. They're all over this because it's.
I did see a few articles about
But what's interesting is that even though they're obviously coming at it from their political vantage points, they are doing probably the most coverage apart from like the Guardian. So I always say it's good to read from places that you might not agree with, because it's just interesting. But so they did a little article about it. This was not long ago. So this was the 16th of February, so like a few days ago. And it had a little like insert in the middle of the article where it was like, okay, history of the Chagos Islands. So we actually know what we're talking about. And it was giving like the geographical context, saying it was uninhabited, center of trade routes, all of this stuff, then what happened during the Cold War. But at no point do they talk about the people, the Chagossians themselves. So I thought it was really symbolic and representative of why this is such an issue.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that happens so frequently where the people themselves that are the most affected are
rendered voiceless.
Crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, as you said, it's not a surprise. But it doesn't make it any less egregious.
Yeah, of course.
And that's what's hard to kind of grapple with. To know that like we're up against something, and we know other societies and other peoples face the same struggles. But it is a relatively small population. Like it was like over the years, it was hovering at the 1,000, 2,000 mark.
Yeah. Blimey. So, as part of your research, you've gone into declassified material. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've discovered during your research, and also why you think these documents were originally classified and are now open to the public?
So we were literally just talking about this in terms of the population size. That was something that the British state specifically wanted to shroud in mystery.
Interesting.
Fabricate. They fabricated like the fact that there was a permanent population and how long they had been there. So a lot of the documents, and this is why history is such an interesting area, and it's so important, because only a few decades ago, what we wouldn't have been talking about in this way, not only because people could say no, but we know X, Y, Z, this is the truth. But then the truth isn't always the truth. Like actually things can be falsified. States do this. We know that it's like a tactic. And especially, as we said, during a Cold War era when like political expedience was, you know, the word of the day. So the going to the archives was fun. I did it for my undergraduate, one of my research projects. So I went over to Kew and I was like, what am I going to find? What am I going to see? Like, I went in with no knowledge of what I might come across. What I was glad to see was kind of like in a lot of the reporting on the history, people cite this really awful communication between like government officials basically just saying what they want to do in very plain terms. So they would say, we want these rocks that are going to be ours. No one's there except for this is awful, outdated language I'm about to use, Man Fridays and Tarzans. And then this is the funniest part. Then they said, because so this was a time in the context, right? This is the 60s. It's a time of renewed like interest in self-determination, in rights, in human rights, decolonization. Like that's what was happening at the time, right? So that's why it was very secretive, and that's reflected in the documents. So they say things like, thankfully there's no committee of the birds, because maybe there was like committees for women's rights and things. But ironically, like there was a significant female population. I think they mentioned that in some of the documents. So it was like basically I'd read those things, but seeing them first, like the documents itself, it's like a big moment. I found so like, you know, you can write to your MP. I saw a letter from a gentleman from Cornwall, I think, or maybe I think it's a place called Strawberry Hill Farm. That's what I remember. So somewhere in the UK, you know, a UK national writing to their MP saying, I write to you to like completely disavow what's going on in the Chagos archipelago. So obviously at the time, there was some news coverage, as much as they were trying to say that it was uninhabited. I think people even then knew that this was a bit of a cover up. So, but he was saying like, you know, his reasons were despoiling of the natural environment, like underhanded politics, things like this. And I was like, this is so, I think that was dated 73, if I remember correctly. I think it was the 70s. So we'd already gone through the initial agreements with the states, which was by Harold Wilson in the 60s. So by this point, it was a different government, a different administration, but it was still ongoing. And so I read that and I was like, I wanted to try and meet either the person if they were still alive or the family. I didn't have enough time to pursue it. But like just reading that was something interesting that I found, because it was like someone here who cared about it. And it's like, I think it is indicative of at least some of the population here who understand why it's so unjust.
Yeah. I mean, what was your reaction like? What was the experience actually like?
To read those documents?
Yeah.
It was
person.
I mean, I guess it was like, it was nice to feel as if I'm, as you said, really doing the research. I think that was just before COVID. Yeah, so I took a lot of photos of things and I've scribbled things down in pencil because we can't use ink in the archives.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so you can't use like pens. You can't, because in case it would damage the materials.
Learn something new every day.
But that is like such a tactile memory for me, because whenever I'm in an archive now, like when I'm doing historical research, you just have to use pencil. So I guess it's a nice way that kind of you feel like you are embodying a different space and you're doing something really purposeful, because we don't really use pencils nowadays for writing anyway. So I guess it's a bit like inhabiting a different kind of mindset. Do you know what I mean? Like you're just kind of stepping out of the present, and that's the wonderful thing about archival research. It's also sad because like practically every borough has a local archive, but people just don't know, or maybe don't have the time. But it's always, if anyone takes something away from this, I'd recommend going to your local archive and doing research.
I mean, I'm certainly gonna, because that's so interesting. Yeah. Wow.
You never know what you might find.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a nice experience, and it was significant for me because it did feel like it was the mark of a journey, the start of a journey where I went from just kind of knowing about this and talking about it with my family, watching documentaries maybe, to actually, as you said, doing it on my own.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. Right, so on the discussion, language is a huge thing. Terms like dispute and debate are often used when talking about the occupation of the islands, and continuous battles for ownership. But I wonder if this language is like strategically chosen to lessen the effects of this land occupation. How would you describe the power of language when talking about, neocolonialism?
Yeah. It's a difficult one because I do use the shorthand of it being like I tend to call it the Chagos affair because I like the kind of mystery that it adds to it. I mean, obviously it was a horrible,
of course,
chapter in history, but the fact is, when I think of it as an affair, I do think I immediately have the connotations of it was a sordid affair. It was like it was political expedience. It was Cold War realpolitik. It was a secret for a long time. So I'm almost inclined to say I do think it's still a debate because, as I think I touched on this before, the Chagossian people aren't a monolith, and you have people who, as I was saying before, are like Mauritian with Chagossian heritage, which means that they maybe are compared to like the settlement in Crawley that we have in the UK. Perhaps they, like a lot of Mauritians who go on to claim Chagossian heritage, maybe want to go to Europe. Maybe they're less focused on wanting to go back. Maybe if they did have an option to visit or had more visitation rights, they'd want to, but they never would entertain the idea of actually settling the islands. Again, for context, they're very small. They're very small islands, like you could walk it.
Yeah.
And so it could be a debate even amongst Chagossians themselves.
Yeah.
So if you look at the older generations, they definitely, rightfully so, are keeping the fight going of saying, like, this is our homeland, this is where my roots are, I must go back. And then, yeah, it varies. So to some degree, I think it is important sometimes to still accept that amongst the people, it's a debate. I suppose in international terms, politically speaking, they wouldn't even think of it as a debate because it's like, it's going to be the military base forever.
Yeah.
So
It's not even up
it's
for
not a
discussion.
question. Yeah. And, you know, I think you when you question that, then you do start to question the international order. And that in itself is a debate as well. So, like, I totally agree with you that words matter. I think sometimes understanding things, like in nuanced terms, means that it's both. It's like Chagos is a question, the Chagos question. But at the same time, we, at least from my perspective, what we need to do is allow Chagossians the space to talk about it, to have a say and to have a voice in it. And that's where there should be no debate about that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. There is a lot of powerlessness there. They have been robbed of the power to be involved. So, like, even just when David Lammy, you know, was being part of the talks to have this agreement, which is actually stalled now. So a lot of people may not know that, like, it's been put on pause. Starmer's pausing it, probably for good reason, because it was agreed between Sunak and the former Prime Minister of Mauritius, Jugnut. So it makes sense, and I can understand why, you know, he would want to talk to Trump about it, and he would want to talk to Ramgoolam about it, who is now the new Prime Minister. But my gut feeling is, I don't think this agreement's going to go through.
Nothing's going to change, ultimately.
I don't think this specific agreement will go through in terms of, yes, as you said, like what the ownership of the islands might be. So I think it entailed ceding the sovereignty to Mauritius, which would then mean that the UK would rent it from them. So that in itself is also really interesting because, again, so I always want to bring it back to what the Chagossians think about this. A number of them don't want maybe Mauritius to own it. For better or worse, they would have different reasons for that. Yeah. I mean, historically, Mauritians really did a number on the Chagossians,
really?
to put it lightly. Yeah, so it's widely believed that Mauritius only gained independence in exchange for the Chagos Islands being given to Britain. So how it worked was, prior to Mauritian independence, Britain removed Chagos from Mauritius as a whole. So like that was part of the territory. Then later gave Britain Mauritius independence, but because by that point they had made Chagos a colony, it wouldn't be independent. So Mauritius would be, but because Chagos had been separate, it was still theirs. You see what I mean?
Very strategic.
It's extremely strategic.
Yeah.
There are no words really for the selfishness of that decision, and it's, you know, it's a stain on Mauritius's history because, you know, we got independence, but at what cost? And so
independence for a few, but not the many.
Exactly. So because of that historical injustice, it's so important now that we hold that close when we talk about the Chagos question, because the Chagossians need to be involved. They can't keep being left out of the conversation, like we saw in that Telegraph article, like we see now. So what I was going to say was, so Lammy was talking about the agreement.
Yeah.
And one Chagossian rights group kind of tweeted, like, he said that he had consulted Chagossians, but we had no knowledge of this. So they're still not being part of
involved in the conversation.
Yeah.
Over their own land.
Yeah.
Ridiculous. It's again, like we said earlier, it's not hard to believe, but it doesn't make it any better. Crazy. So statistics wise, nearly 96% of the population of Chagos is occupied by British or American settlers, with the native population exiled from the lands. How is this displacement, how has it affected Chagossian culture and way of life? What's the reaction been?
Yeah, so the depopulation happened from the 60s onwards, as we say, overlapped with Mauritian independence. It's interesting to note that it wasn't like all at once, because of the nature of the settlement before it became the military base. So Chagossians would often travel like back to Mauritius, back as in like literally that way, and also back because they maybe had family there. It was not uncommon for Chagossians to maybe go to Mauritius to get certain medical treatment, different reasons. It was, it's like a neighbouring country, so they just like get a boat from a port, go back and forth. And that was why also it was easy for England to fudge the numbers, because they would say like, no, those weren't permanent.
Traveling through kind of.
Yeah. So it's part of the story is like, some Chagossians were in Mauritius or abroad at the time that the depopulation was happening. I put it in inverted commas because, it's like a euphemism. It's being ripped from the land that you've made your own for generations, quite violently, I think. So some reports are that, their dogs were gassed as a kind of,
I did read that.
as a warning, perhaps. I mean, I don't know what else that could be. If you're doing that, it's to scare the population, right? It's like,
no
you could be next.
Interpreting that, yeah.
Yeah. So that, I'll call it depopulation for, lack of a better word. So as I say, some were like in Mauritius when they maybe were at the port wanting to get on a boat, and then someone would say, no, you're not allowed to go back for work. You're not allowed to go back for work. And it's like, no, I need to go back. And also I live there. But they weren't. So it was a different story for a few people. Some people had just really awful ordeals because of the nature of the route that they took to remove them. Yeah. One lady, I think Marie-Élysée, she's part of a group that like are really active in the rights, talking about what their experience was. And she was pregnant when she was on the boat. And because of the trauma, she lost the baby. Jeez. Yeah. So it was an ordeal before we even get to what happened after with the loss of the culture. Yeah. So you have this extremely traumatic experience of being taken away from your homeland, right? That happens first. Then, as you say, you're displaced. This is another reason why Mauritius is culpable, because unfortunately a lot of Chagossians experienced terrible treatment once they were in Mauritius. I mean, like, some of the documents in the archive talk about this. So they were saying, we fear that they'll be left languishing on the beach. So, I mean, it's crudely said, but it was the experience of many Chagossians that they really struggled to adapt to island life in Mauritius, because it was so specific, their way of life on the Chagos archipelago. It was like very much, you had everything you needed, and it was a very local, as I said, it was a small population.
Small community, yeah.
Yeah. So they definitely, as you were alluding to, lost a lot of that culture. What's been nice recently, so I think it was in 2016, I'm going to say, or thereabouts, some researchers in Britain, I can't remember what university, I want to say Manchester, but that could be wrong. It's easy to look up online. And it's, hopefully we can like bring it up on screen or something. It was a project done to, what's the word for like when you want to keep something going, like record and to basically have a record of what a lot of Chagossian culture involved. So whether it's to do with how they prepared coconut products, because there's a lot of exports. Again, not many people know this, from Chagos. Some of which included, I think you mentioned copra in your notes, and coconut products. So to kind of keep that memory alive, it's a really great site to see like what traditional Chagossian culture involves. So as we said, food production and music and dancing and things like that. So that was a good step from UK research to kind of keep that memory for the Chagossian people, and they were like really heavily involved. So that's another interesting thing. Although it could be perceived as lost in a way at a time,
there's still efforts to.
It's still there. Yeah, you can find it online, and the Chagossian population lives on. So it's different. I was talking to my mum about this as well. Like Chagossian Creole, which is the language, she says it's like it was a lot more Creole than Mauritian Creole, because like even now, like Mauritian Creole is not the same Creole that my parents speak. It's so crazy how quickly a language can change. So it's important to retain that, like you were saying.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah. So we're taking a bit of a detour. We're going to talk a little bit about the political aspect of it. Because there's a bit of a mentality, there's a mentality in the West that our politics and foreign politics aren't linked. Especially when it comes to countries. Sorry, I can't read. Essentially that what happens in other countries has nothing to do with us. It's not our problem, essentially. And we dissociate, or we're kind of taught to dissociate, I suppose, from these issues. But talking about foreign politics and comparing it to ours is a great way of bridging that disconnect. For example, elections that have recently happened. We're talking about Mauritius. They had their election last year.
November, yeah.
Yes, which we spoke about earlier. And the results were relatively similar to that of the election that happened here, which was in July, as both countries use first past the post as their electoral system, which, by the way, we have another episode on that if you wanted to learn a little bit more about electoral systems. But we use the same electoral system, and it resulted in an overwhelming victory for the what is it? The Coalition for Change, is it? Led by Ramgoolam.
Yes.
So
Navin.
Yes.
Yeah.
In Mauritian Parliament.
Yeah.
The Assembly, they have 62 seats. And 60 of them were taken by the coalition, whereas MSM, which is the Militant Socialist Movement, received 27% of the vote, but only received 2 seats. Now, we kind of spoke about earlier kind of the idea that electoral systems isn't really thought about, like considered over there, just because it was what was implemented. But what is the Mauritian reaction to the system of first past the post? Because over here there's quite a lot of political apathy around it because of the lack of representation within Parliament it results in. So what's kind of the Mauritian perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so I think you're correct that here in the UK there is voter apathy. But I think I mentioned this before. I think the majority of the population, rightly or wrongly here, aren't familiar with first part or even the concept of different voting systems.
Yeah.
Because we're just a bit disconnected. So I mean, like, if you was to speak to just passers-by on like the street, they might be hard pressed to really explain the intricacies of how first past the post works. So I think it's a similar thing in Mauritius. I think everyday people take their electoral system as a given. So rightly or wrongly, like that's just the reality. And you can say the same for politics in general. Like most people just are like getting on with their daily lives unless you're like really interested.
Yeah.
You just don't really know.
Yeah.
And that's kind of fair enough. I was talking about this with my facialist yesterday. Like, I'm of the belief that like it should actually maybe be that everyone can kind of just get on with their life and, you know, hopefully would be involved in a community in a sense, which would then mean to understand local issues. But, you know, ruminating on like really big questions like that isn't everyone's cup of tea, and it doesn't have to be. Again, I would hope that like in a different circumstance, maybe people would still want to, you know, care about what's happening, in which like immediately affects them, and maybe, you know, what's happening around the world. And we do see that with like people being involved in like global movements. But in terms of like Mauritians' reaction to political issues like Chagos and maybe like how they vote, the same way it is here, I think they just don't really know. And I do kind of know that like there isn't really much debate about proportional representation, as far as I can tell. The reason that it was such a landslide with the November elections is because they just really hated Jugnut. He was a despot. And unfortunately, it's pretty common in Mauritian politics for that to happen over time. Unfortunately, there is a lot of corruption, just really awful leadership. That's the truth.
Happens.
So yeah, so they voted to get him out, and that was like the slogan of the day. Like that was, you know, just booze li dehors, which means like get him outside, just shove him out. And they had a lot of like, this is the great thing about Mauritians, as much as, you know, as we were saying, there are issues with like apathy and like selfishness with like maybe topics like what's happening with Chagos. They are really funny and they can turn a great phrase. We can turn a phrase. I say they because I'm not as fluent, so I'm not very good at doing that. But it always tickles me when I hear it. So yeah, like they'd call him Pinocchio and things like that, which is just so much funny in an Mauritian accent, like Pinocchio, you know. Yeah, so it was just to get him out really, because to be honest, Ram Ghulam, who's in now, who is actually the son of Mauritius' first ever prime minister.
Yes, I did read that. Wikipedia.
Make of that what you will. He himself set the terms for what kind of leader you could be. So really, if you want to kind of go into it, Jugnut was just following in Ram Ghulam's footsteps, and now ironically Ram Ghulam is back in.
Yeah.
So it's more of the same. But that being said, they are a coalition. There's a new party in called Resistance Alternative, and so before they were even part of mainstream politics and you know, in a actual government, I went to their ecological retreat last time I was in Mauritius, because they were involved in a lot of like, that's kind of it means resistance and alternative, as you can tell. And it's about like a lot of ecological concerns. I hope that they translate that into their policy. We don't know yet. It's still kind of too soon to tell. But they were definitely not, I think maybe they didn't even expect to get in. We didn't know. I think most people now, with the benefit of hindsight, were like, yeah, they would definitely, Jugnut was going to go. But yeah, so your question was about first past the post. Yeah, I think it was more so about just really wanting to get rid of Jugnut.
I see. So, kind of, in your opinion, going back to the idea of the distance, I suppose, between Western politics and foreign affairs, what do you believe is the cause of this disconnect? Why do we have this kind of mentality of us versus them, I suppose?
Do you mean amongst politicians or everyday people?
I think everyday people. Kind of whenever you see the news about foreign affairs, very few people actually pay much attention to it, unfortunately. I think unless it's a big story, people aren't so engaged. Why do you think that is? Because I suppose we engage in Western politics. I mean, the recent American election, we were far more engaged with that election than we were with others. Why do you think that kind of happens?
Well, I think it's kind of related to what we were saying before in terms of like how much capacity we can expect people to have for caring about things, or like what I mean to say is like it's really hard to make a life work in the UK right now. So in a way, I'm not really, I'm not resentful if people don't feel like they have the capacity to know what's happening or what the Chagos question is
of what's even happening in our own country.
And like exactly. Yeah. And to worry about getting food on the table. The cost of living here, as it is in Mauritius, is extremely high. So I think the why is things like that. It's just the very like straightforward, people have enough going on.
They don't have the capacity.
Yeah. But I don't think that means that they can't and they shouldn't, because once you then start to drill into it, so like we just said, if it's it's not exclusive to Britain, things like struggling to make it to like actually pay for what you need to eat and like for medical services, a lot of what issues that you'd find in Mauritius you'd also find here on just a different scale. So I think there's an opportunity there for people to see that like this is a systemic issue. This is to do with how we organize ourselves. And then that's also where history comes in useful, because then we can say, well, we've had options in our history as a species as to how we choose to organize ourselves and how we choose to actually lead, as in be led. So it's a shame maybe that we don't make those connections, because then we might start to think, oh wow, like it's just really rubbish all around. What are we going to do about it? And that's what the hope is now with Mauritius, for example. Like now that they've got him out, the hope, especially like amongst like kind of politically engaged people, is that, and in general, is that Mauritius will start to be for Mauritians again. So maybe we can actually work towards implementing policies that make people's lives better. And I would say the same here. I think hopefully we can, it's really a question of like political engagement, isn't it? So we just have to think realistically how to do that. And it's really important right now because of parties like Reform. Like we should try to dialogue and understand why it's so appealing. And I can understand it. So like Farage was speaking about Chagos recently, and he said he was also talking about, it would be out of the question to give them citizenship, things like that. He might have been talking about Mauritius, but I think it's linked. I don't think he would also want Chagossians to have citizenship, although they have had for a long time. And that was part of the kind of reparative efforts that Britain was making. So I think it's useful, but I think actually I would say that it's up to people who are involved and engaged to do the work to reach people and make it relevant to them, because I can't expect people to just want to care. It is a country that's very far away, and it is like it feels obscure to them, and I can understand why. Even for Mauritians, like growing up, like at the time this was all happening, it's only when my mum, for example, came to the UK and grew a bit older that she started to actually realize what had happened, probably because it became declassified information. But yeah, it's work to like actually make connections and understand political systems, and it's up to people who want to make it understandable to do that. I think
put in the effort. Thank you so much for that. We still have so many questions, but unfortunately we have run out of time. Just as a final note, did you want to talk about anything you've got coming up or you're working on that you're proud of?
I think what I would like to talk about is just really to guide people to look at Chagossian groups online. So I've tried to kind of say throughout this that, I'm Mauritian. As I said, we really, I think we owe it as part of our reparative efforts to really give a voice to Chagossians, to make sure that they are being part of this conversation. So I would just encourage everyone to look up like documentaries online. There are plenty now, thankfully. A lot of legal work is being done, which has, I think, helped like propel that forward. And also, please start making these international connections, because back in the 60s, 70s, I remember reading I didn't read it, it was part of a documentary, but there's a newspaper article Chagossian saying, we feel like the Palestinians of the Indian Ocean. These are connected stories, and there are overarching issues at play, in terms of hegemonic powers, just doing what they do. So to put it lightly, so liberation, for one, is liberation for all. And once we start to make those dots, then we can really get some work going.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Inherited Worlds, Series 5 of the Amplify podcast. We want to say a huge thank you to Val and Geneva for their insights, to Mia Diaz for her work behind the scenes on the day and in post-production, and a big thank you to Aisha Campbell for bringing it all to life on social media. We want to say special thanks to Pirate Studios in Hackney for providing us the space to bring this conversation alive. If you'd like to learn more about the Rise Collective and support our work in uplifting young creatives, visit our website www.therisecollective.org.uk or follow us on social media at The Rise Collective UK. Know your power, amplify your voice, own your future. Rise.